Have you ever noticed how exhausted you feel at the end of a day in which nothing difficult actually happened? No crisis, no confrontation, only conversations, messages, small adjustments of tone, and yet something inside you feels worn thin, as though you had spent the entire day carrying a weight you were never permitted to set down. Or caught yourself rehearsing a sentence before saying it, softening it, rearranging it, testing how it might sound inside somebody else's mind, and then, hours later, replaying that same sentence anyway, still wondering whether it landed the way you intended. And have you ever wondered, quietly, in a moment you never described to anyone, how many of the things you call your ambitions were ever truly chosen by you at all? Carl Jung spent the greater part of his life sitting across from patients who had done everything correctly. They had built the careers. They had earned the respect. They had assembled lives that looked, from any reasonable distance, like success. And still they arrived somewhere in the middle of life, carrying a symptom that had no medical name. A flatness, a quiet unreality, the sensation of observing their own existence from slightly outside it. Again and again, Jung discovered the same thing. These patients were not broken, they were simply not living their own lives. Somewhere along the way, without ever consciously deciding to, they had handed the authorship of their existence over to the collective, to the expectations of family, the standards of a profession, the approval of individuals whose judgment they had never actually agreed to accept. This video is not about confidence. It is not about learning to care less, or performing indifference, or building a thicker skin. Those are surface repairs applied to a much deeper fracture. We are going to enter a harder question, and it is the question Jung believed every human being must eventually face. What is actually left of a person when the audience goes quiet? Because the freedom we are speaking about here has never been the freedom to be admired. It is something far rarer than that. It is the ability to remain someone, solid, real, recognizable to yourself, inside a room where nobody is watching at all. Number 1. The borrowed self. How a life is built out of other people's expectations. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to live somebody else's life. That is not how it happens. It happens by accumulation, through thousands of small adjustments, each one so reasonable at the time that it never registered as a surrender. Jung described an early psychological condition he called participation mystique, a state in which the individual has not yet separated from the collective around them. Inside that state, a person cannot fully distinguish their own emotion from the emotional atmosphere they are standing in. A child does not experience the tension in a household as something belonging to their parents. They experience it as weather, as something happening to them, in them, as them. And every family, every school, every culture quietly teaches the same lesson without ever saying it aloud. Certain parts of you are welcome here, certain parts are not. The welcome parts are met with warmth and attention. The others are met with silence, or correction, or that particular kind of disappointment that lands heavier than anger. The child understands this immediately. Children are geniuses of adaptation. They learn which version of themselves keeps the room safe, and they become that version with astonishing skill. This is not weakness, it is intelligence, a survival strategy executed by a small person who accurately assessed that belonging mattered more than authenticity, because at that age, it genuinely did. Difficulty arrives decades later, when the strategy is still running, and nobody has told it that the emergency ended. You are no longer a child in a house you cannot leave. Yet the same instinct still operates beneath your decisions. You still scan a room for its temperature before you know what you think. You still notice the shift in someone's face and adjust before consciously registering why. You still choose the path that produces the least disappointment in others, and you call this being reasonable, or considerate, or mature. The world will ask you who you are, Jung once observed, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. That is not a poetic warning. It is a description of a mechanism. The psyche cannot tolerate a vacuum at its own center, and where there is no self-definition, definition arrives from outside, so smoothly that it feels like discovery rather than installation. Elena had built a life that photographed well, the degree her family respected, the profession that ended dinner party conversations with an approving nod, the apartment, the routine, the reliable competence everyone around her had come to depend on. She was 34 years old and had never once been called irresponsible. Then one evening, she found herself sitting in her car in an underground parking garage 20 minutes after arriving, unable to explain why she had not gone inside. Nothing had happened that day. Nothing had gone wrong. She simply could not locate a single decision in her entire adult life that had been made because she wanted it, rather than because somebody whose opinion mattered would approve. She was not unhappy. That was the strange part. She was something more disorienting than unhappy. She was absent. A house built upon rented land can be beautiful, well made, admired, photographed, envied. But it does not belong to the person living inside it, and some part of them always knows this, even during the years when nobody is asking questions. What they experience is not fear exactly. It is a low, chronic vigilance, a sense that the ground beneath the structure was never theirs to build on, and that the arrangement continues only as long as the terms are honored. Focus only on yourself, in this first sense, does not mean rejecting the people who shaped you. Jung had no interest in that kind of adolescent rebellion. He considered it psychologically primitive. It means something far more precise and far more difficult. It means learning to distinguish, in real time, between a preference that arose inside you and a preference that was installed there. Most adults have never made that distinction even once. They have never sat with a decision long enough to ask where it originated, because the question feels dangerous, and because an honest answer would require rearranging a great deal. But there is a reason the borrowed self cannot hold indefinitely. A life assembled from other people's expectations requires constant confirmation from those same people in order to feel real. That requirement, over time, becomes something closer to a hunger. Number 2, the applause you cannot hear, why approval never satisfies. There is a particular disappointment almost nobody speaks about honestly, because admitting it sounds ungrateful. It arrives the moment you finally receive the thing you were working toward, the recognition, the position, the message from the person whose opinion carried the most weight. And you notice, somewhere in the first hour, that it has not filled anything. There is a brief brightness, a warmth that behaves almost like satisfaction. And then, faster than expected, the ordinary quiet returns, and you are standing exactly where you were before, holding something that was supposed to change you and did not. Most people interpret this correctly at first and then explain it away. They conclude the achievement was too small, or arrived too late, or was witnessed by the wrong audience. So they raise the target and begin again, and the entire cycle repeats, with a slightly larger prize and an identical ending. Jung understood the structure of that cycle with unusual clarity. Every form of addiction is bad, he wrote, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. The substance is not the point. What defines an addiction is the relationship. Something outside the self is being used to regulate something inside the self. The regulation is only ever temporary, and so the dose must continue. Approval functions in exactly this way. It works, and that is precisely the problem. If it did not work, nobody would organize a life around it. A word of praise genuinely does produce a shift in the nervous system, a momentary settling, a brief sensation of being solid. And because the relief is real, the psyche learns the route, returns to it, and keeps returning long after the traveler has stopped noticing that they are traveling. But recognition cannot be stored. This is the mechanism almost nobody understands. It is metabolized immediately, in the same way reassurance is metabolized by anxiety, which is why reassurance never cures anything. The mind does not archive the compliment as evidence. It consumes the compliment and returns to baseline, and the baseline is unchanged, because the baseline was never built from external material to begin with. A person drinking salt water is not doing anything irrational. They are thirsty. What they are drinking is genuinely liquid, and it genuinely enters them. It simply leaves them thirstier than before. The tragedy is not that they are foolish. The tragedy is that the more faithfully they follow the sensation of relief, the further they travel from the thing that would actually resolve it. Marcus received the promotion he had spent 6 years pursuing. He remembers the announcement, the messages, the dinner his colleagues arranged. He remembers his father's voice on the phone and how long he had waited to hear that particular tone in it. And he remembers, with an embarrassment he has never described to anyone, sitting in his kitchen 48 hours later, feeling absolutely nothing, and being frightened by that nothing more than he had ever been frightened by failure. Because failure has an explanation. Failure tells you to work harder, and work is something a person knows how to do. Emptiness after success removes the explanation entirely. It suggests the ladder had no connection to the thing you were climbing toward, and that suggestion is unbearable, which is why most people immediately find a new ladder rather than sit with what they have just learned. What makes this so difficult to escape is that the appetite disguises itself as ambition. It looks like drive, it looks like standards, it produces results the world rewards, which means the world has no reason to intervene and tell you to stop. Society has no mechanism for identifying someone who is succeeding for the wrong reasons, because from the outside, the two are indistinguishable. And beneath the appetite lies a much simpler question, one the psyche has been trying to answer through indirect means for years. Am I acceptable? Not am I impressive, not am I useful, but simply, is there anything here that would be permitted to exist, even if it produced nothing at all? The hunger for approval is that question, asked in a language that cannot possibly answer it. Each time you ask the world responds to what you did, and the question was never about what you did. Focus only on yourself, at this level, does not mean refusing praise or pretending recognition means nothing to you. Pretending is simply another performance, and the psyche is not deceived by it. It means noticing, with some honesty, how much of your energy each day is spent hunting a sensation that has never once lasted, and asking what would need to change internally for the hunting to become unnecessary. Yet the moment you examine that appetite closely, you encounter something unexpected. Underneath the hunger for approval sits a much older arrangement, a decision, made long ago, about which parts of yourself were permitted to exist at all. Number 3. The shadow you outsourced, the parts of yourself you handed to other people. Pay attention to who irritates you, not the people who genuinely mistreat you. That is a different matter entirely, and it deserves a different response. Notice instead the disproportionate irritation, the colleague whose confidence produces an almost physical discomfort, the acquaintance who takes up space without apologizing and leaves you strangely agitated for the rest of the afternoon, the relative whose choices you find yourself criticizing with far more energy than the situation could possibly require. Jung wrote that everything which irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That sentence is quoted constantly and understood rarely because most readers take it as an instruction to be more tolerant. It is not. It is a diagnostic tool, and it is considerably more uncomfortable than tolerance. What he meant is that the intensity is information. Ordinary dislike is quiet. Disproportionate reaction indicates that something inside you has been touched, some quality you also possess, or once possessed, and disowned in order to remain acceptable. Every one of us, in the process of becoming someone the world could accept, made a set of decisions about what to keep. The anger was too dangerous, so it went underground. The ambition was too visible, so it was covered over. The need was too exposed, so it was denied. Whatever strangeness or intensity or desire a particular household could not tolerate got placed somewhere it would not be found. The accumulated result is what Jung called the shadow, and his essential insight was that the shadow does not vanish when it is buried. Nothing in the psyche vanishes. It goes underground, continues to operate, and returns through the only door left available to it, through the way you perceive other people. So the man who buried his own anger becomes exquisitely sensitive to anger in everyone else. The woman who disowned her appetite for attention grows contemptuous of anybody who seeks it openly. Someone who was forbidden to be selfish will spend a lifetime detecting selfishness everywhere and will not once understand why the detecting is so exhausting. You did not eliminate those parts of yourself. You outsourced them. You handed them to other people to carry, and now you must live in a world populated by strangers, holding your disowned material, and you must react to them constantly, and every reaction draws something out of you. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. This is where the phrase, "focus only on yourself," becomes genuinely radical and genuinely unpleasant. At this depth, it does not mean turning away from others out of self-protection. It means recognizing that a significant portion of what you have been reacting to was never entirely about them at all. It was your own material, returning to you wearing somebody else's face. A woman wrote to this channel, describing a colleague she had disliked for 2 years. The dislike had 100 justifications, each one reasonable, each one confirmed by others in the office. Then, during a conversation with a friend, she heard herself list the complaints out loud, and something turned over in her, because every single item on that list described a way of moving through the world she had wanted since she was 19 and had never once permitted herself. She had not been observing a difficult colleague. She had been watching someone live a version of her own unlived life and calling the resulting pain a personality conflict. There is a specific grief that arrives when this becomes conscious, and it is worth naming honestly rather than skipping past. It is the grief of realizing how much of yourself you sealed off, how early you did it, and how long you have been guarding the place where you left it. Nobody prepares anyone for that grief. It is not depression, though it can resemble depression. It is closer to mourning, a mourning for a person who was never allowed to develop. If you are listening to this and something has begun to surface, a name, a memory, a version of yourself you set down somewhere and never returned for, leave a comment and say what it was. It does not need to be explained. It does not need to be resolved. It only needs to be a fragment of something true you have carried alone for a very long time. Sometimes the first moment a buried thing comes back is the moment it is finally spoken to somebody. Because what you buried does not stay buried. It grows in the dark on its own terms, and eventually it makes itself known, either as a symptom you cannot explain or as an inner voice that will no longer accept the arrangement. Number 4. The inner authority, the voice that was there before the audience. There is a moment that happens to most of us at least once, and almost everybody ignores it. You are about to agree to something. On paper, it makes sense. It is the reasonable choice, the responsible choice, the one that will be met with approval by everyone whose approval you have organized your life around. And somewhere beneath your ribs, without language, without argument, something says no. Not loudly. It does not need to be loud. It arrives as a heaviness in the body, or a sudden reluctance you cannot justify, or a strange tiredness that appears the instant the choice is spoken aloud. And you override it, because it offered no reasoning, because everything on the surface pointed the other way, and because you have been trained for decades to trust the surface. 6 months later, or 6 years later, you understand exactly what it had been telling you. Jung took that signal extraordinarily seriously. Anyone with a vocation hears the voice of the inner man, he wrote. Vocation acts like a law from which there is no escape. He was not describing a career. The word carried its original meaning, a calling, a summons originating inside a person rather than handed to them. Here is the part that matters. This is not the voice of the ego. The ego manages appearances, calculates outcomes, negotiates with the world, and keeps score. The ego is loud, articulate, and constantly reasoning. What Jung pointed toward speaks far less often and never argues. It simply registers a direction, which is precisely why it is so easily overruled. In any contest between a voice offering elaborate justification and one offering none, the justifying voice wins every time, until enough years accumulate that the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. A compass placed near a piece of iron does not stop working. That is what makes it dangerous. The needle still moves. It still settles firmly, with total apparent confidence, and points somewhere. It simply points at the iron instead of at magnetic north, and anyone navigating by it will walk with complete conviction in the wrong direction for as long as the metal remains close. Other people's opinions are the iron. Not one dramatic distortion, but a constant low-grade pull, present in every judgment call, so consistent that it has come to feel like judgment itself. Someone close to me left a position that had been slowly hollowing him out. Everyone supported the decision. His family agreed, his colleagues understood, and several friends told him he had been brave. He said later that the approval made it harder rather than easier, because he could not tell whether he had actually chosen it or had simply located a form of leaving that others would applaud. Almost a year passed before he made a decision nobody praised, and he described that one as the first in a decade that felt unmistakably his. That is the strange test, and it is worth sitting with. If a decision is only ever confirmed by other people, you cannot yet know whose decision it was. Learning to hear the inner authority is not mystical, and Jung was insistent about this. 2 conditions are required: and modern life is arranged to prevent both. Silence is the first, not the absence of noise, but the absence of input. The inner signal is quiet, and it does not compete. It will not interrupt a podcast. It will not raise itself above a feed. It becomes audible only in the spaces most of us now fill instinctively, within seconds, without ever noticing the reflex. The second condition is a willingness to be wrong in front of people, because the first several times you follow that quiet registering, you will not be able to justify it. You will make a choice that appears irrational to people who love you, and you will have no defense except that something in you knew. Most of us cannot tolerate that exposure, and so we return to the compass pointing at the iron, because at least the iron is agreed upon by everyone. Focus only on yourself, at this depth, means restoring the order of authority. It does not mean the world's opinion becomes worthless. It means the world's opinion stops being the first thing consulted and becomes the last. Information rather than instruction. But the moment you begin actually living from that inner authority, you discover what the language of self-discovery almost never mentions. It costs something, and the cost arrives before the reward does. Number 5. What it costs. The part nobody prepares you for. Almost everything said about becoming yourself is described as a homecoming. Warm, peaceful, quietly triumphant. The mask comes off, the true self emerges, and life becomes lighter. Jung described something considerably harder, and he did not soften it. Personality can never develop, he wrote, unless the individual chooses his own way consciously and with moral deliberation. He then made clear what that choice actually involves. Whoever takes it becomes to some degree separated from the collective and pays for the separation in a currency most of us are unwilling to spend. Here is what that means in practice, described honestly. Some relationships will thin, not dramatically, and usually without any confrontation at all. A friendship running for years on shared complaint loses its subject when you stop complaining. A bond organized around your reliability becomes uncertain when you begin declining things. Withdrawal is rarely announced. The messages simply arrive less often. The invitations require slightly more effort, and one day you notice that a connection you assumed was permanent had in fact been conditional on a version of you that no longer exists. Certain people will experience your change as an accusation, and this is worth understanding rather than resenting. When somebody near you stops performing a role you both agreed to, it raises a question about their own performance that they never asked for. Most manage that discomfort by finding fault with the person who changed. You will be described as selfish or difficult or as having become distant, and some of those saying it will genuinely believe it. And there is a period, usually longer than anyone expects, in which the old structure has loosened and nothing has replaced it. You have stopped organizing your life around approval, and you have not yet built anything sturdy enough to stand in its place. The external scaffolding is down, while the internal foundation remains unfinished. That interval is not failure. It is simply the shape of the process, and it is where most people turn back, because the discomfort is real and the return route is always open. In late autumn, a tree drops everything that made it recognizable. Anyone observing without knowledge of the cycle would conclude it was dying, the visible life gone, the structure exposed, nothing apparently happening. What is actually occurring is that resources have been withdrawn from display and moved into the root system, and the growth that follows in spring is possible only because of the season that looked like loss. The psyche works the same way, but offers no calendar. Nobody tells you how long the winter lasts. A viewer once wrote that in the 2 years after he stopped shaping his life around other people's expectations, he lost most of his social circle, disappointed his family repeatedly, and spent a great deal of time genuinely uncertain whether he had made an enormous mistake. Doubt was the hardest part, he said, far harder than the loneliness, because no evidence was available. Everyone around him had an opinion, and the only thing supporting him was a quiet sense of rightness that could not be shown to anybody. He also said he would not go back, but he was careful to point out that he could not have known that at the time, and that anyone promising certainty during the crossing is not describing something real. Jung believed this price was not a flaw in the process. He believed it was the process. Something has to be given up for something else to develop, and what gets given up is precisely the safety of being universally understood. Whoever requires everyone to approve of their becoming has not yet begun becoming. They have simply found a more sophisticated way to ask permission. Focus only on yourself, here, is not a promise of ease. It is a decision made with full knowledge of the cost, which is the only kind of decision that survives contact with reality. Yet the interval does end, not because the world becomes kinder, but because something begins to form on the inside that no longer requires the world to be kind. Number 6. Living from the center, a life that does not require witnesses. What eventually replaces the need for approval is not indifference, it is structure. Jung placed at the heart of his psychology the idea that the personality has a center, not the ego, which is only the conscious fragment, but something larger, containing everything a person is, known and unknown. He called it the self. The work of a human life, in his view, was the slow and uneven process of relocating from the ego to that center. He named the process individuation, and he was clear that it is never completed, only approached. This center does not appear through insight alone. Understanding your patterns changes nothing by itself. A great many people can describe their own psychology with impressive accuracy and still live exactly as they always have, because the description was performed by the same ego that built the arrangement. Practice is what builds the center, and the practices are unremarkable. Stillness comes first, and specifically, stillness that is not filled. Not meditation as a wellness activity, but the deliberate refusal to reach for input the moment a gap appears. The first waking hour without a screen, a walk with nothing playing, an evening permitted to be uneventful. What makes this difficult is not the silence itself, but what surfaces inside it, which is exactly why it works. The material arriving in unfilled time is the material that has been waiting years to be heard. Second comes the deliberate direction of attention. Jung used the term libido to describe psychic energy in general, the force behind attention, interest, and vitality. And his central observation was that this energy is finite and flows wherever it is aimed. Most adults are not exhausted by their work. They are exhausted by maintaining relationships that ended emotionally long ago, by tracking the lives of strangers they will never meet, by conducting silent arguments with individuals who are not present. Every one of those is a withdrawal from the same account, and the account does not refill on its own. A symbolic life is the third, and Jung considered it indispensable, while considering modern people almost entirely deprived of it. The psyche does not orient itself through logic alone. It requires image, ritual, and repetition. This is what journaling actually is, and why it works when honest rather than performed. It is what a fixed morning ritual accomplishes, Some find their footing through attention to dreams, or through making something with their hands, or through returning to the same place at the same hour for no productive reason whatsoever. These practices produce nothing the world can measure. That is not a weakness in them. That is the entire function. Privacy is the fourth. Not privacy born of shame, but privacy chosen out of value. In an era where experience is not considered fully real until it has been shown to somebody, keeping something no one else knows about is a genuine act of psychological consolidation. Whatever is never displayed cannot be shaped by anticipated reactions. A part of your life stays yours. The greatest problems of life, Jung once observed, can never be solved, but only outgrown. That is what outgrowing looks like. The need for approval is not defeated in a decisive moment. It becomes small, gradually, because something else has grown large enough to occupy the space it used to fill. Thomas is 61. He has a small circle, a small routine, and a life that would generate very little interest if described to anyone. He tends a garden nobody else sees and reads in the same chair every evening. By every visible standard, his existence is ordinary, and there is a quality of presence in him that people notice immediately and cannot name. A complete absence of the low background performance most adults run continuously without knowing it. He is not managing an impression. He is simply there. A well does not chase the rain. It is fed from underneath, through channels invisible to anyone standing at the surface, which is why it holds water through the seasons when nothing falls from the sky. A bucket carried from someone else's well works perfectly, right up until the day the distance becomes too far or the owner closes the gate. Focus only on yourself, in its final and truest sense, means becoming a well rather than a bucket. Not sealed off from other people, a well serves everyone who comes to it. Simply no longer dependent on their weather for whether there is anything inside. At some point you realize that what exhausted you was never the work and never the difficulty and never even the disappointments. It was the unbroken effort of remaining visible to an audience that was never watching as closely as you imagined. Remember the question we began with: what is left of a person when the audience goes quiet? This is the answer. What is left is the only part that was ever actually yours. You were not placed here to be understood by everyone. You were not given a psyche this complex in order to spend it monitoring the expressions of people who will forget the conversation by evening. The soul does not grow under observation. It grows in the hours nobody sees, in the choices nobody praises, in the quiet where a person finally stops asking whether they are permitted to exist and simply begins to. Go where the pull comes from inside you, even when you cannot explain it, even when nobody applauds, even when the ones who love you do not yet understand. Because the whole purpose of a human life was never to be approved of. It was to be lived by the person it was given to.